Imagine this. You're sitting in a crowded room, surrounded by laughter, conversation, the electric hum of human connection. Everyone seems perfectly content, riding the surface of small talk like skilled surfers on gentle waves. But you feel something else entirely. A strange weight pressing against your chest. A peculiar distance opening up between you and everyone around you. While they discuss weekend plans and trending topics, your mind drifts elsewhere, caught in an undertow of questions they don't seem to notice. Why does this feel so hollow? What are we really saying beneath these words? What invisible architecture holds this moment together? You smile, you nod, you participate, but inside, you're conducting an entirely different conversation, one that nobody asked for, one that nobody else seems to hear. Today, you and I will walk through concepts that have guided philosophers, psychologists, and great thinkers throughout history. And among everything you will hear in this journey, the final revelation, the one that comes at the end, is the most powerful of all. It is a truth capable of transforming the way you understand yourself and the people around you. This exploration examines the psychology of people who are deep thinkers. These individuals navigate life with an uncommon level of awareness, curiosity, and emotional sensitivity. Throughout history, minds like Carl Jung, Friedrich Nietzsche, Hannah Arendt, Viktor Frankl, and many others have attempted to understand this rare way of perceiving reality. In this journey, we will dive into their insights and explore how their ideas illuminate the inner world of those who reflect more profoundly than most. Whether you are a deep thinker yourself or simply want to understand someone who is, this journey will guide you toward greater clarity, emotional intelligence, and self-mastery. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe, leave your like, comment your thoughts, and share this with someone who needs it. The revelations ahead may help you better understand your own mind or the mind of someone important in your life. And I promise there are insights coming that can truly change the way you see the world. Now, back to that moment of peculiar isolation in a crowded room. You experience a paradox that most people will never understand. You are simultaneously more connected to the depths of human experience than anyone around you, and yet more isolated than if you were standing completely alone. This is not loneliness. This is not social anxiety. This is something far more mysterious. What if I told you that this experience, this strange gift of perceiving layers beneath the obvious, isn't a flaw in your design? What if the very thing that makes you feel different, disconnected, sometimes unbearably aware, is actually evidence of a fundamentally different operating system running inside your mind? Here's the unsettling truth. Most people navigate life like passengers on a predetermined route, following invisible scripts they never consciously chose. They adopt beliefs without examining them. They feel emotions without questioning their origin. They make decisions based on patterns they've never stopped to recognize. They live, in a sense, on autopilot, and they're perfectly comfortable with it. But then there are the others. The ones who cannot stop asking, why? The ones who see a sunset and don't just feel beauty, but wonder about the nature of beauty itself. The ones who hear a simple statement and immediately excavate the assumptions buried beneath it. The ones who experience a single emotion and find themselves mapping an entire psychological landscape, tracing connections that seem to appear out of nowhere. These are the deep thinkers, and their minds work in ways that most people will never understand. But here's where it gets fascinating and disturbing. What if this capacity for depth isn't just a personality trait? What if it's a fundamental rewiring of how consciousness itself operates? What if deep thinkers don't just think more than others, but actually perceive a different dimension of reality altogether? Consider this paradox. The same mental architecture that allows deep thinkers to see profound meaning in ordinary moments also condemns them to feel profound alienation in ordinary social spaces. The same sensitivity that makes them extraordinarily empathetic also makes them vulnerable to emotional overwhelm. The same analytical power that helps them solve complex problems also traps them in paralyzing cycles of self-doubt. Their greatest strength is simultaneously their deepest burden. And here's the question that will haunt you long after this exploration ends. If you recognize yourself in this description, if you've spent your life feeling like you're perceiving something others miss, wrestling with thoughts that seem too heavy for casual conversation, seeking meaning in places where others find only routine, are you discovering a truth about yourself? Or are you finally understanding why you've always felt like a stranger in a world that wasn't built for minds like yours? The answer lies deeper than you think, and what you're about to discover will either validate everything you've ever suspected about yourself or completely shatter the way you understand human consciousness. Because the psychology of deep thinkers isn't just about thinking differently. It's about existing in a fundamentally different relationship with reality itself. There's a question most people never think to ask. Why do some minds naturally turn inward while others remain perpetually focused outward? Why does one person walk through life accepting things as they appear, while another cannot help but dismantle every experience? Searching for the mechanisms hidden beneath the surface? The answer reveals something unsettling about human consciousness itself. Deep thinking isn't simply a habit you can develop through discipline or education. It's a fundamental orientation of the psyche, a different way of processing reality that emerges from the deepest structures of your mind. Carl Jung spent decades studying this phenomenon, and what he discovered challenges everything we assume about normal human cognition. Jung identified that some individuals possess what he called an introverted intuition, a cognitive function that doesn't just observe the external world, but constantly interprets the invisible patterns, symbols, and psychological currents flowing beneath observable reality. This isn't introversion in the social sense. It's something far more profound. It's a mind that naturally gravitates toward the unconscious, toward meaning, toward the hidden architecture of existence itself. But here's where the problem begins. Society doesn't reward this kind of thinking. In fact, it actively punishes it. We live in a world obsessed with speed, efficiency, and surface-level engagement. The modern environment demands quick responses, immediate reactions, and constant external stimulation. It values those who can process information rapidly and move on without lingering. Deep thinkers, by their very nature, cannot function this way. They need time to digest experiences. They require solitude to process complexity. They must pause, reflect, and examine before they can genuinely understand. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this tension intimately. He observed that society creates what he called herd morality, a set of shared beliefs and behaviors that keep people moving in the same direction, thinking the same thoughts, accepting the same truths without question. This collective mentality provides comfort and belonging for most people, but for deep thinkers, it feels like suffocation. Nietzsche wrote about those rare individuals who could think beyond the herd, who questioned the foundations of morality, truth, and existence itself. He called them free spirits' minds, capable of standing apart from collective thinking to examine reality from a more fundamental perspective. But he also recognized the psychological cost of this freedom. To think deeply is to accept a form of existential loneliness, because you see things others cannot see, and you cannot unsee them. This is the hidden problem. Deep thinkers are born into a world that wasn't designed for them. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps and went on to found logotherapy, observed something crucial about human psychology. He noticed that people who possessed a strong internal world, those who could find meaning even in suffering, had a psychological resilience that others lacked. But he also recognized that this same capacity for depth made them more vulnerable to what he called existential frustration, the anguish of living in a world that seems meaningless or superficial. Deep thinkers experience this frustration constantly. They sit through conversations that feel empty. They participate in social rituals that seem performative. They watch people chase goals that appear hollow. And all the while, they're silently asking questions that nobody else seems interested in exploring. What is the point of this? What are we really doing here? What deeper truth are we all avoiding? The psychologist Abraham Maslow identified that individuals with higher self-awareness, those he studied as self-actualizing people, shared a common trait. They were all deeply reflective. They questioned their own motivations, examined their emotions, and constantly sought to understand the essence behind behavior and existence. But Maslow also noted that these individuals often felt alienated from mainstream society because their internal standards and values didn't align with conventional expectations. Here's what makes this particularly painful. Deep thinkers cannot choose to stop thinking deeply. Their minds don't have an off switch. They cannot simply decide to accept things at face value and move on. Their cognitive architecture compels them to dig deeper, to question further, to seek understanding even when it would be more comfortable to remain ignorant. Jean-Paul Sartre described this as the curse of consciousness, the burden of being aware that you are aware, of knowing that you are constantly choosing how to interpret your existence. For most people, this awareness remains dim, operating in the background. But for deep thinkers, it's a constant, unavoidable presence. Every moment becomes a philosophical question. Every choice reveals layers of meaning. Every interaction contains depths that must be explored. And this is where the real problem emerges. The very thing that gives deep thinkers their greatest gift, their ability to perceive meaning, understand complexity, and navigate psychological depths, also separates them from the simple comfort of unconscious living. They cannot return to innocence. They cannot unknow what they've discovered. They are condemned, in a sense, to perpetual awareness. But the consequences of this run even deeper than isolation or existential frustration. There are hidden costs to thinking deeply that nobody warns you about, costs that shape your entire relationship with yourself and the world around you. What nobody tells you about thinking deeply is this: it doesn't just change how you see the world, it changes how the world sees you. And more dangerously, it changes how you see yourself. Deep thinkers carry a burden that remains invisible to everyone around them, while others experience thoughts as fleeting visitors that come and go. Deep thinkers experience thoughts as permanent residents that build complex cities inside their minds. Every observation branches into a dozen reflections. Every emotion triggers an archaeological dig into its origins. Every conversation leaves behind layers of analysis that continue processing long after the words have stopped. This isn't poetic exaggeration. This is neurological reality. Neuroscience research reveals that individuals with heightened introspective capacity show different patterns of brain activation compared to the general population. Their default mode, network the brain system for internal reflection and self-referential thinking, remains unusually active even during tasks that would normally quiet it. In simple terms, their minds never fully stop examining, questioning, and analyzing. While most people can shift their attention outward and leave internal reflection behind, deep thinkers operate with a persistent background process that never shuts down. The consequence? Exhaustion that others cannot understand. You finish a simple social interaction and feel drained. Not because the interaction itself was difficult, but because your mind immediately began processing every micro-expression, every tonal shift, every unspoken tension in the conversation. You replay moments, analyzing what was really being communicated beneath the surface. You question your own responses, wondering if you said what you truly meant or simply performed the expected social script. And by the time you finish this internal analysis, you've expended more mental energy than the actual conversation required. People tell you you're overthinking. They tell you to just relax, to stop analyzing everything, to live in the moment. But they don't understand you can't. Your mind doesn't work that way. Telling a deep thinker to stop analyzing is like telling someone to stop breathing. It's not a choice. It's how the system operates. But the exhaustion is just the surface consequence. Beneath it lies something more insidious. Deep thinkers often become their own harshest critics. Because they possess the capacity to see multiple perspectives simultaneously, they can also see all the ways they fall short. They analyze their mistakes with surgical precision. They replay their failures in high definition. They hold themselves to standards of authenticity and consistency that would crush most people under their weight. Sigmund Freud described this as the overactive superego, an internal judge that constantly evaluates, criticizes, and demands perfection. For deep thinkers, this internal judge never rests. It examines every decision, questions every motive, and searches for inconsistencies between who they claim to be and who they actually are. This relentless self-examination can lead to a peculiar form of suffering, the inability to simply be, without constantly evaluating whether you're being correctly. And here's the trap. The more deeply you think, the more you become aware of your own cognitive biases, emotional patterns, and psychological defense mechanisms. You start to see the ways you deceive yourself, the stories you tell to maintain your self-image, the unconscious strategies you use to avoid uncomfortable truths. This awareness should be liberating. And sometimes it is, but it can also create a paralysis of self-consciousness where you can no longer trust your own thoughts because you're too aware of all the ways they might be distorted. Arthur Schopenhauer observed that increased consciousness often brings increased suffering. The more aware you become of life's complexities, contradictions, and ultimate uncertainties, the more difficult it becomes to maintain the simple pleasures that others take for granted. You cannot watch a movie without analyzing its underlying themes. You cannot enjoy a conversation without noticing its unspoken dynamics. You cannot experience a moment of happiness without immediately questioning its authenticity, or wondering when it will end. This is the cognitive burden of depth. Everything becomes layered. Nothing remains simple. Every experience carries the weight of meaning, interpretation, and analysis. But there's an even darker consequence that emerges over time. Deep thinkers often find themselves trapped between two equally painful realities. On one side, they feel alienated from mainstream society because most interactions feel superficial and most conversations lack the depth they crave. On the other side, they feel alienated from themselves because their own minds have become so complex, so labyrinthine, that they can no longer find solid ground within their own thoughts. This creates what psychologists call existential isolation, a feeling of fundamental separateness, not just from others, but from existence itself. You begin to feel like an observer of your own life, rather than a participant. You watch yourself make decisions, feel emotions, and interact with others, but there's always a part of you that remains detached, analyzing, questioning whether any of it is real or meaningful. The philosopher Albert Camus described this as the absurd, the disconnect between humanity's search for meaning and the universe's apparent silence on the matter. Deep thinkers feel this absurdity more acutely than others because they cannot stop searching for meaning even when they suspect none exists. They are trapped in a perpetual quest for understanding in a reality that may be fundamentally incomprehensible, and society offers no refuge from this. In fact, modern culture actively amplifies the problem. We live in an age of constant distraction, instant gratification, and surface-level engagement. Social media rewards quick reactions, not deep reflections. Professional environments value efficiency, not contemplation. Even our relationships often prioritize convenience and comfort over genuine depth and vulnerability. Deep thinkers navigate this landscape like foreigners in a strange land, constantly translating between their internal experience and the external expectations of a world that doesn't speak their language. They learn to wear masks, to simplify their thoughts, to hide the full complexity of their inner world, because revealing it often leads to misunderstanding, judgment, or uncomfortable silence. But here's what makes this truly dangerous. Over time, this constant translation, this perpetual masking, this endless simplification of who you really are begins to erode your sense of authentic self. You start to forget which version of you is real. The simplified version you present to the world, or the complex, questioning, endlessly reflective version that exists in solitude. This is the unseen consequence that changes everything. Deep thinking doesn't just separate you from others. It can separate you from yourself. And yet, despite all of this, despite the exhaustion, the self-criticism, the existential isolation, the sense of being perpetually misunderstood, there is something emerging on the horizon. A possibility that most deep thinkers never discover because they're too trapped in the burden to see the opportunity hidden within it. What if everything you thought was a weakness is actually pointing toward a form of freedom that most people will never experience? Here's the radical truth they don't tell you. The very thing that makes you feel broken is what makes you whole. Everything you've been conditioned to see as a problem, your relentless questioning, your inability to accept simple answers, your exhausting need to understand the depths beneath every surface isn't a flaw that needs fixing. It's a form of consciousness that needs directing. The rebellion begins with a single revolutionary realization. You were never meant to fit into a world designed for surface-level thinking. Trying to force your mind into that mold is like trying to contain an ocean in a teacup. The problem isn't the ocean. The problem is the teacup. But understanding this intellectually isn't enough. The real transformation requires something more dangerous. You must stop apologizing for the way your mind works. Think about how much energy you've wasted trying to suppress your depth. How many times have you dumbed down your thoughts in conversation to avoid making others uncomfortable? How often have you pretended to be satisfied with superficial answers when your mind was screaming for more? How frequently have you judged yourself for overthinking, overanalyzing, or feeling too much? This self-suppression isn't humility, it's self-betrayal. The philosopher Immanuel Kant argued that enlightenment begins when you have the courage to use your own understanding without guidance from others. For deep thinkers, this means something specific. You must give yourself permission to think as deeply as your nature demands, regardless of whether others can follow you there. But this permission comes with a critical distinction. There's a difference between thinking deeply and thinking destructively. Destructive thinking is the endless loop of self-criticism, The paralysis of overanalysis? The anxiety that comes from questioning everything, including your own capacity to question. This is depth without direction, a spiral that leads nowhere except further into confusion and self-doubt. Constructive depth is different. It's the conscious choice to direct your analytical power toward understanding rather than toward judgment. It's the ability to observe your thoughts without becoming enslaved by them. It's the practice of using your sensitivity as a tool for insight rather than as a weapon against yourself. Carl Rogers, one of the founders of humanistic psychology, discovered something profound in his therapeutic work. The people who achieved the deepest transformation weren't those who stopped feeling intensely or thinking deeply. They were the ones who learned to accept their depth without resistance. They stopped fighting their own nature and instead learned to work with it. This is the first act of rebellion, radical self-acceptance. Not the superficial self-love promoted in motivational posts, but the difficult, unglamorous work of accepting that your mind operates differently, and that this difference is not something to be cured or overcome, but something to be understood and channeled. Here's how this works in practice. When you catch yourself spiraling into overthinking, instead of judging yourself for it, pause. Recognize that your mind is doing what it was designed to do, seeking patterns, searching for meaning, trying to protect you by understanding everything completely. Thank it for its vigilance. Then consciously redirect that analytical power toward a specific, constructive question rather than letting it scatter in all directions. When you feel exhausted from social interaction, stop labeling yourself as antisocial or broken. Recognize that you've been processing information at a depth that would overwhelm most people. Honor that exhaustion as evidence of genuine engagement, not weakness. Then create the solitude you need without guilt or apology. When you notice yourself perceiving layers of meaning that others seem to miss, resist the temptation to either suppress your observations or force them into conversation. Instead, keep a private record, a journal, a notes app, a voice memo, where you can honor your insights without needing external validation. This leads to the second act of rebellion, strategic solitude. Henry David Thoreau wasn't running away from society when he lived at Walden Pond. He was creating the conditions necessary for his mind to function at its highest capacity. Deep thinkers need solitude not because they hate people, but because depth requires space. Your mind cannot explore complex territories while simultaneously managing the cognitive load of social performance. But here's the crucial part. This solitude must be active, not passive. It's not about hiding from the world. It's about creating a sanctuary where your thoughts can fully unfold without interruption. It's where you read deeply, write freely, think without censoring, and allow your mind to make the unexpected connections that produce genuine insight. The third act of rebellion is perhaps the most difficult: selective authenticity. You cannot be fully authentic with everyone. This isn't dishonesty, it's wisdom. Not everyone has earned access to the depths of your thinking. Not every conversation warrants the full complexity of your perspective. Not every relationship can sustain the weight of your genuine self. Jean-Paul Sartre understood this when he wrote about authenticity, not as constant self-revelation, but as conscious choice. You get to decide who receives your depth and who receives only your surface. This isn't wearing a mask, it's understanding that different contexts require different levels of engagement. Save your depth for those who can meet you there. Seek out the rare individuals who don't just tolerate your way of thinking, but genuinely appreciate it. These connections may be few, but they will sustain you in ways that 1,000 superficial relationships never could. Friedrich Nietzsche had a powerful insight about this. He said we should be careful about seeking understanding from those who cannot provide it, because their inevitable misunderstanding will make us doubt ourselves. Better to embrace noble solitude than to prostitute your depth before those who cannot recognize its value. The final act of rebellion is the most powerful. Transform your curse into your purpose. Viktor Frankl discovered in the concentration camps that those who found meaning in their suffering could endure almost anything. For deep thinkers, this means recognizing that your capacity for depth isn't random. It's pointing towards something. Your ability to see patterns others miss makes you an exceptional problem solver. Your emotional sensitivity allows you to understand and help others in profound ways. Your relentless questioning positions you to discover truths that surface-level thinking will never reach. Your comfort with complexity prepares you to navigate challenges that would paralyze simpler minds. The world doesn't need more people who think shallowly. It needs people who can see what others cannot see, who can ask questions others are afraid to ask, who can hold complexity without collapsing into simplification. This is your rebellion. Stop trying to think less deeply. Start thinking more purposefully. But there's one final truth that brings everything together. One ultimate realization that will forever change how you understand your own mind and the minds of every deep thinker you'll ever encounter. Now we arrive at the revelation that changes everything, the truth that has been building beneath every word, every insight, every observation throughout this entire journey. But before I reveal it, I need you to understand something. What you're about to discover isn't just information. It's a lens that, once looked through, can never be removed. It will reframe every conversation you've ever had with yourself about why you think the way you do. It will illuminate the deepest patterns of your consciousness, and it will either liberate you completely or disturb you profoundly, possibly both. Here it is, the ultimate truth about deep thinkers. You don't just think about life, you think about thinking itself. And this meta-awareness, this capacity to observe your own consciousness, is both the source of your suffering and the gateway to a form of freedom that most human beings will never experience. Let me explain why this changes everything. Most people experience thoughts as if they are their thoughts. When anger arises, they become angry. When fear emerges, they become afraid. When a belief forms, they become that belief. There's no space between the thinker and the thought. They are merged, unified, indistinguishable. But deep thinkers operate differently. You don't just experience thoughts, you watch yourself experiencing thoughts. You don't just feel emotions, you observe yourself feeling emotions. You don't just hold beliefs, you examine the very process by which beliefs form in your mind. This is what philosophers call metacognition, thinking about thinking. And neuroscience has confirmed something remarkable. The brain regions associated with metacognitive awareness are more active and more developed in individuals who demonstrate deep, reflective thinking. Your prefrontal cortex, particularly areas associated with self-monitoring and executive function, operates at a level of intensity that most people never access. Carl Jung spent his entire career trying to understand this phenomenon. He called it the individuated consciousness, a mind that has separated itself from the collective unconscious enough to observe its own processes. Jung believed this was the highest form of psychological development, but he also recognized it came with tremendous psychological weight. To see yourself seeing is to lose the innocence of unconscious existence. Here's why this matters more than anything else you've learned. When you understand that your suffering comes not from thinking deeply, but from thinking about your thinking without understanding what you're doing, everything shifts. The problem has never been the depth of your thoughts. The problem has been that you're watching your thoughts with the same critical, analytical intensity that you watch everything else, and this creates an infinite regression of self-observation that can trap you in paralysis. Think about it. You have a thought. Then you have a thought about that thought. Then you judge the thought about the thought. Then you worry about why you're judging. Then you analyze why you're worrying. And suddenly, you're 5 layers deep in metacognition, completely disconnected from the original experience. This is the trap of unguided depth. Your gift of awareness becomes a prison when it turns endlessly inward without purpose or direction. But here's the revolutionary insight. The same mechanism that creates this trap is also the key to transcending it. When you understand that you can observe your thoughts, you realize something profound. You are not your thoughts. You are the awareness that witnesses thoughts. And this distinction, this space between the observer and the observed, is where true freedom lives. Ancient Buddhist philosophy discovered this truth thousands of years ago. They called it mindfulness, or witness consciousness, the practice of observing your mental processes without identifying with them. Modern psychology has rediscovered this same principle and found that it's one of the most powerful tools for managing anxiety, depression, and existential suffering. But for deep thinkers, this isn't just a therapeutic technique. It's the natural conclusion of your way of being. You've already been practicing observation your entire life. You've just been doing it unconsciously, without realizing what you were doing or why it was causing you so much pain. Viktor Frankl expressed this beautifully when he wrote about the space between stimulus and response. He said that in that space lies your freedom, your ability to choose how you respond rather than simply reacting. For deep thinkers, this space is vast, almost infinite. You have so much room between experience and reaction that you can examine, analyze, and question everything that happens in that gap. Most people see this as overthinking, but it's actually the foundation of conscious choice. When you stop judging your depth and start directing it, you discover something extraordinary. You can observe your anxiety without becoming anxious about being anxious. You can notice your thoughts spiraling without being pulled into the spiral. You can feel intense emotions without losing yourself in them. You can hold multiple contradictory perspectives simultaneously without fragmenting. This is what philosophers call negative capability, the ability to remain in uncertainty, mystery, and doubt without the irritable reaching after fact and reason. It's the capacity to sit with complexity without needing to resolve it immediately. And here's the ultimate paradox. The very thing that makes you feel different from everyone else, your constant awareness of your own consciousness, is actually evidence of an evolutionary advancement in human cognition. You're not broken. You're not overthinking. You're operating at a level of self-awareness that represents the cutting edge of what human consciousness can become. Anthropologist Terence Deacon studied the evolution of human consciousness and concluded that self-reflective awareness, the ability to think about thinking, is what fundamentally separates human beings from other species. But within humanity itself, there are degrees of this self-reflection. Some minds have developed this capacity more fully than others. Deep thinkers represent the leading edge of this development. But with this gift comes responsibility. You cannot unknow what you now understand. You cannot return to the unconscious simplicity of unreflective existence. You are condemned, and I use that word intentionally, to awareness, to consciousness, to depth. But this condemnation is also your liberation, because once you understand that you are not your thoughts, but the awareness behind them, you gain access to a form of inner freedom that most people never discover. You can choose which thoughts to engage with and which to let pass. You can observe your emotions without being controlled by them. You can analyze situations without losing yourself in analysis. This is what it means to master depth rather than be mastered by it. The final truth is this: deep thinkers don't just experience life, they witness it. And in that witnessing lies both the burden of perpetual awareness and the possibility of conscious transcendence. You will always see more than others see. You will always feel more than others feel. You will always question more than others question. This is your nature, but now you understand why. You're not overthinking. You're not broken. You're not too sensitive or too analytical or too intense. You are conscious of consciousness itself. And that makes you both incredibly vulnerable and incredibly powerful. So here's what I want you to do with this knowledge. Stop fighting your depth. Stop apologizing for your complexity. Stop trying to think like people who cannot think the way you do. Instead, direct your awareness intentionally. Use your gift of observation to witness your thoughts without drowning in them. Create the solitude your mind requires to function at its highest level. Seek out the rare individuals who can meet you in the depths. And most importantly, recognize that your way of perceiving reality isn't a malfunction, it's an evolution. The world needs people who think deeply. It needs minds that refuse to accept easy answers. It needs observers who can see patterns in chaos, meaning in suffering, and possibility and complexity. That's you. That's who you've always been. And now you know why you cannot be any other way. The question is no longer, why do I think so deeply? The question is, what will I do with this depth now that I understand its true nature? Your answer to that question will determine whether your gift becomes your prison or your purpose. Choose wisely. Choose consciously. Choose with the full weight of your awareness. Turn toward possibility rather than limitation. Because in the end, the psychology of deep thinkers isn't about suffering or isolation or existential burden, though all of those are real. It's about the extraordinary privilege of being awake in a world where most people are still sleeping. And once you're awake, truly awake, there's no going back. There's only the choice of what to do with eyes that see what others cannot see, with a mind that perceives what others cannot perceive, and with a consciousness that understands its own nature. This is your inheritance. This is your responsibility. This is your power. Use it well.